Hi, everyone. Welcome to my presentation today on understanding and healing the inner child through evolutionary astrology. My name is Chahal. I'm a certified evolutionary astrologer based in London, England, and I've qualified through the Jeffrey Wolf Green School of Evolutionary Astrology. I've added my contact details at the end of this talk. Should anyone wish to contact me or get in touch with me to find out more, I will give you that information at the end of the talk. So I'm just going to dive right in because this is a subject that's really close to my heart as I also work through healing my own inner child. So I'm going to start off by talking about the power of EA, because this paradigm of astrology allows us to track the soul's evolutionary journey from life to life. And Pluto, by house, sign, and aspects, shows us the evolutionary desires that a soul has come into this incarnation. And for any soul to experience and exhaust its desires, it needs to create an ego, because the soul comes into the physical body. And the ego is the vehicle through which the soul gets to fulfill its evolutionary desires. And the ego self-image that it creates correlates astrologically to the fourth house Cancer moon archetype. And then the question then becomes why? Why did a soul need to create a particular race, culture, country, gender, and even socioeconomic reasons? And ultimately, we can see that it boils down to three possible reasons. It can be karmic necessity, it can be evolutionary necessity, or can be an element of both. Karmic necessity ends up being karma that we may need to resolve from a previous incarnation. And evolutionary necessity is the soul needs a particular experience to evolve its evolution, to accelerate it forwards. And I find that a lot of cases, there's an element of both that applies. So there's a key point that you need to remember is that evolution for all of us can only occur through the emotional body. And that's because the sheer fact is that we are human beings in a physical body. And the emotional body in evolutionary astrology correlates astrologically to the fourth house, the Cancer, and the moon archetype. And as a result, the moon shows us the early childhood environment that a soul is born into. And what happens is then the moon's nodes, that's the south node and the north node of the moon, plays a key role in understanding the egocentric image that we all end up creating. Therefore, the moon becomes an emotional bridge between the past, which is the south node of the moon, and the future, which is the north node of the moon. And so we're born into this incarnation, into a particular family environment for our own soul's evolutionary purpose. And it's important to understand this because what happens is that the early childhood environment is what shapes our self-image. And if our early childhood environment doesn't provide us with the nurturing that a child needs, we end up creating displaced emotions. And these displaced emotions resurface in adulthood and most often are mirrored back to us via our outer relationships. And if we don't work through these displaced emotions, they tend to just resurface again and again through the relationships that we form. So then the question becomes, how can we resolve them? And I would say that's through healing the inner child that we all embody. So before we look into the whole evolutionary astrology archetype of the inner child, I found that the Oxford Dictionary referred to the inner child as a person's supposed or true self, especially when regarded as concealed in adulthood. And as I've discussed in EA, the inner child dynamics can be seen through the fourth house, the Cancer, the moon archetype. And again, a key question that we need to look at is, why would a soul create a particular experience? And on every occasion, we need to refer that back to the natal position of Pluto that shows us the evolutionary desires of the soul, where it's come from, which is the south node of the moon, and where it's seeking to go in this incarnation, which is the north node of the moon. So what happens with the fourth house archetype is inner child imprinting can take place. And just to give you a perspective here, the fourth house cusp, the location of its planetary ruler plus aspects it makes, the location of the sign of Cancer in your natal birth chart, and the planets in the sign of Cancer, and the location of the natal moon by house, sign, and aspects, plus its ruler, can show us the inner child imprinting that we've all experienced. And we always have to, again, go back to the question, why? Why did the soul need to experience this? Why have we been born with these particular patterns? And it's important to remember that in each lifetime, an ego is created because the soul desires to exhaust its desires. And eventually we will merge back into spirit, back to spirit. And that's that natural trinity in the natural zodiac between Cancer, the ego, Scorpio, the soul, Pisces, the spirit. It's all connected. And I wanted to actually give a physical example of an individual I feel has actually worked through his inner child imprinting and dynamics. And we can see why he has come into this incarnation with the childhood experience that he had. I'm sure you're probably all aware of who Robert Downey Jr. is, but I'm just going to give a little bit of background information that will kind of set the scene when we look at analyzing his natal birth chart. Because EA, as you're most probably aware, you have to observe and correlate a soul's life journey in order to give it some context. So Robert Downey Jr., he's an American actor and producer. He was born to an actress mother and father who was a filmmaker and actor in New York City. He made his acting debut at the age of 5 in one of his father's films. He also grew up surrounded by drugs, as his father was a drug addict who allowed him to use marijuana at the age of 6, which his father later regretted, and his mother was also an alcoholic. His parents divorced in 1978, and he moved with his father to California. But in 1982, he dropped out of high school and he moved back to New York City to pursue acting full-time. Between 1996 to 2001, he was arrested several times on drug and alcohol-related charges. He also attended drug treatment programs unsuccessfully. And in 1999, he was sentenced to 3 years in jail for breaking his parole agreements. This is when he actually told the judge he had been addicted to drugs since the age of 8, when his father, who was also a drug addict, gave them to him. So drug addiction and alcoholism has run in his family. And he even ended up losing quite a few acting roles and being fired from a very successful show at the time called Ally McBeal. And what led him to working through his addictions was in 2003, when his then girlfriend, now wife, Susan, gave him an ultimatum. She basically told him, if you do drugs, I'm gone. And this was the incentive and the drive that got him to sort his life out. He then went on to complete a 12-step program. He took yoga, meditation, and even undertook therapy in order to overcome his addictions. And now, so if we look at his natal chart, first and foremost, we will look to his natal Pluto in the second house in the sign of Virgo. Because Pluto shows us the evolutionary desires of the soul. This is the desire that his soul has incarnated with. And that placement shows us that his desire has been to develop self-reliance and self-sufficiency. There's a strong survival instinct within his soul. And in the sign of Virgo, it shows that the soul's been learning lessons around discrimination, personal humility, purification, and self-improvement. And you'll also notice that his natal Pluto is retrograde. And the retrograde archetype in evolutionary astrology is all about redo, repeat, and relive. So he's kind of come into this incarnation with the soul needing to repeat past life dynamics. So he's able to liberate himself from them. You'll notice that he's actually got 5 planets that are retrograde. So that makes his whole personality a retrograde personality, which makes an individual quite introspective. And that's quite important, I feel, to know, because it's like he turns his inner focus within his life. So straight away with a Virgo Pluto, there could be a sense that the soul could be quite critical, quite negative in thinking. But that particular placement, I feel, with the 5 planets retrograde, brings in an introspection into his soul that has the strength to overcome any particular difficulties that it may experience. And we'll see that in his childhood imprinting in a second. So if we move on to looking at the past life egocentric identities that he's potentially created, we can see that the south node of his moon is in the 5th house in the sign of Sagittarius. This shows us that in a past life incarnation, he may have been somebody who had a special sense of destiny, that he had a special purpose to fulfill in his life. I would even go as far as to say that he may have been a child prodigy, which in his earlier life as Robert Downey Jr., he was deemed to be by the media. And the ruler then of that south node of Sagittarius is his natal Jupiter in the 10th house of Taurus. That, for me, shows that he may have been in positions of authority. He may be surrounded by fame, material possessions in a previous incarnation. So he's come into this incarnation with a sense of being special. And we can even see that with his ascendant being in the sign of Leo, a special sense of purpose within him. And a point to note here is, before we move on to the north node of his moon in the 11th house of Gemini, he's got planets square in his nodal axis. And that's a skip-step signature in evolutionary astrology. That basically means that in a past life, he's tried to move towards that north node in Gemini without fully completing the lessons of the south node of the moon in the 5th house Sagittarius. So he's kind of been flip-flopping back and forth between the moon's nodes. So therefore, the north node of the moon ends up playing a kind of de facto south node of the moon role in a previous incarnation. And I would say that this shows that at some point in a past life, he may have been forced into exile. That's that 11th house placement, isolated from others, because his beliefs may have been different. And that's because the ruler of that north node of Gemini is Mercury retrograde, sitting in his 9th house of Aries. I feel that his past life story has been around him trying to utilize the power he had, the ruler of his south node being in the natural 10th house, which is about natal Capricorn in Saturn, and trying to follow his desires, where he's been challenged by others around him. And I'd say there was a sense of just choosing to be on his own. And that's his natal Pluto retrograde conjunct Uranus retrograde, and even Mars retrograde in the 1st house. Just chosen to go back within himself, retreat back into his own world. And just, it was better to be alone than to be with others. And so what's happened, him coming into this incarnation, with his Pluto retrograde, he's literally picked up from where he left off. So the childhood imprinting that we would look to in his chart would be the 4th house cusp, which, as you can see, is ruled by Scorpio. It would be the 12th house, because that's where we find the sign of Cancer. And then it would also be where the position of his natal moon, which is in the 10th house in the sign of Taurus. So with his 4th house being in the sign of Scorpio, we can see straight away that he's been born into an environment where there would have been a sense of powerlessness, abuse, abandonment, and loss. And his early childhood environment was never going to provide him with the nurturing that a child needed. So the question then here becomes why? Why did the soul need to experience that? And as I said earlier, because his past life story seems to be around a sense of being special, he may have related his specialness to the position he held in a past incarnation. So coming into this lifetime, it was to experience a sense of humility. And there's that Pluto in Virgo in the second house. He needed to self-analyze and self-improve. And the environment that he was born into was surrounded by drugs and alcohol. And there's that Neptune in Scorpio retrograde in his fourth house. Because we know in astrology, Neptune rules alcohol, drugs, and escapism. And we see a double signature of that placement with the sign of Cancer sitting in his 10th house, where not the 10th house, the 12th house, and where the 12th house is naturally the Pisces Neptune ruled house, and a sense of early childhood disillusionment and not being his needs not being met, because the ruler of that 12th house, Cancer, is his natal moon in the 10th house of Taurus. It's like his natal moon sign being in that 10th house, Taurus, is the nurturing or mothering that he needed. There would have been a sense of limitedness around it, repression around it, where he would have had to rely on himself in most cases. And he would have had to be his own authority. And if we can also see that the moon in Taurus is opposing his natal Neptune in Scorpio. It's like he needed to throw off emotional patterns of relating that limited his growth. And he had to find a balance between his inner fourth house and outer worlds, which is the 10th house. And the ruler of his natal moon in Taurus is also the Venus in the 9th house, Aries. So the self-image that he has in this lifetime is actually of a survivor. He's internally has a very strong core nature. And when he sets his mind on something, he actually is a soul personality that would go for it. And I did find a quote that he said, "I've always felt that if you're not on your own side, why should anybody else be? So I've always encouraged people to be confident, and sometimes even a little falsely so, just so you can give yourself an opportunity." Straight away, with that particular statement, I can see the South Node in Sagittarius, that sense of specialness playing out, his ascendant being Leo, and his sun sign also in Aries conjunct the Venus in Aries, with the Venus being the ruler of his moon. He had to be thrown back onto himself in order to overcome the displaced childhood emotions he experienced. We can clearly see the fact that his nurturing and essential needs weren't met in childhood. And it's because on a deep soul level, he needed to dissolve the old emotional structures. There's your moon opposing your Neptune, that his soul has been fixated to. And we can also see this playing out with the fact that his natal Pluto polarity point, which is a soul's evolutionary intention in the lifetime, was to confront the limitations of his value systems. He has clearly, over lifetimes, has limited himself to a particular way of thinking, sort of like that frog in the well syndrome. And he needed to now move towards moving away from that and dissolve all the barriers that prevented him from connecting to a higher power. And that's where you find the Pluto polarity point in the 8th house in the sign of Pisces, which incidentally will be conjunct his natal Saturn in Pisces. I really feel that for this particular soul, the original parental environment that he was born into was a karmic necessity, and that his parents have played a key role in a previous incarnation, and they were to set him on his soul's evolutionary path in this incarnation. And if we just move forward, I can explain how I feel he's healed his inner child. We saw that Cancer ruled his natal 12th house. So he surrendered to a higher power. And with his natal moon positioned in the 10th house of Taurus, he actually took self-mastery, self-responsibility for his drug and alcohol addiction. He never actually put blame onto anyone outside of himself. We can also see that the ruler of his moon is Venus in the ninth house, which represents love relationships. And it's also the lower octave of Neptune Pisces, the 12th house. And it took his relationship with his then girlfriend and now wife, Susan, to give an ultimatum. You know, it's either me or drugs, as she said. And that's when his value system would have actually kicked in and gone, no, this is the woman I want to be with. So he took responsibility for his choices. And incidentally, he never once blamed either of his parents for his childhood experience. He confronted the limitations he's experienced. And like I mentioned, he dissolved the barriers that's prevented him from connecting to a higher power. So by embracing yoga, by embracing meditation and seeking therapy, which is a Scorpio archetype, where his Pluto polarity point sitting in the eighth house Pisces represents, he took emotional self-responsibility. And I personally found it quite fascinating that the way he spoke about his parents was like a child that had all the nurturing that it needed. He said that my father, when my dad and I would do drugs together, it was like him trying to express his love for me in the only way he knew how. And about his mother, he said, she was my role model as an actor and as a woman who got sober and stayed that way. My ambition, tenacity, loyalty, moods, grandiosity, occasional passive aggression, and my faith, that's all her. And I wouldn't have it any other way. So, how can we all help? How can EA help us understand and heal our childhood dynamics? So we can all look back to our early childhood environment in the natal chart to see what imprinting took place. So that's looking at the fourth house, the sign that's on the fourth house, and the aspects that the ruler of that fourth house makes. Looking at your natal moon sign, seeing what sign it's in and where the ruler sits, and looking at where the sign of Cancer sits in your own natal chart. And then also applying it to both the south node of the moon and the north node of the moon. It's because the family that we're all born into plays a key role in setting the conditioning patterns for the rest of our life. And the question ultimately becomes why? Why did my soul need to experience this particular parenting, this particular childhood environment, etc.? And I've personally found that evolutionary astrology can provide this insight. A personal example I quickly want to share with you is the fact that my fourth house is ruled by the sign of Sagittarius. And I'm a twin, by the way. I have a twin sister, and we both have Jupiter. Mine is sitting in the 12th house. Hers is at the cusp of the end of the 11th house. And it's both conjunct Mercury. An interesting fact my mother actually told me was when we were younger, when we started nursery, we couldn't actually speak English. My ethnicity is British Indian, and my mother tongue is Punjabi. And so we grew up in a household where only Punjabi was spoken. And we actually ended up learning another language, Hindi, that's because we grew up surrounded by Bollywood films. And it was only when we started school did we learn to speak English, to the point now that it's quite strange for me to imagine a time where English was not my first language. So it's quite interesting to look at your chart and look at certain patterns and speak to your parents if you can, if to know more about your childhood, what their view of your childhood is. Because with my sister and myself, though we're twins, that particular Jupiter placement means that our interpretation of our childhood is very different. And as we both continue to heal our own childhood experiences, the choice that we both have and that we all have is to choose to continue living with any displaced emotions that could be taking place, or we can choose to heal from them. And I found that evolutionary astrology was a stepping stone for me in healing the childhood emotional dynamics. And it's because I understood the patterns that my soul was trying to create. And by taking self-responsibility for those particular patterns, I'm able to move forward in my own evolutionary journey. and that's something that we all can do individually as well. So yeah, this was a pretty short but sweet presentation. This is a subject that I will continue to talk about more. It's a subject that I'm working on also to talk about at the Jeffrey Wolf Green Association of Evolutionary Astrologers conference that's taking place in October. There is a link on the screen for that particular organization if you want to have a look. And I've actually put on there the School of Evolutionary Astrology.com as well, if you're interested, just finding out more about evolutionary astrology. And if you want to contact with myself, I have got my Instagram page, which is under the handle Free Spirit Life Coaching. I have a website. You can contact me through email as well. Yeah, so just come and connect. And if you have any questions, please do reach out. You can even put them under this video on YouTube, and I'll endeavor to get back to you. So yeah, so that was the end of that presentation. And I know Sue is somewhere here.
I am. And
with us.
Rav, that was amazing. You did such a good job. It was so well articulated. And I will put your contact information on the description of the video on YouTube for
Thank you.
people want to get in touch with you. And I thank you so much for this talk. I can't express enough how well articulated and how you presented. You went through step by step and just really explain the whole thing. And we look forward to hearing much more from you.
Thank you, Sue. That means a lot. Thank you.
Thank you.